It's now my great pleasure, and please feel free to retake your seats. It's my great pleasure to introduce Steve OSTROFF, who needs no introduction to us all here. Steve has, of course, been serving as FDA's acting commissioner since April 2015, and he will now provide us with a keynote address. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. I don't know what happened to the slides. Oh, there they go. So thanks very much. Once again, I'll reiterate what I said yesterday, which is to thank both Martin and Alistair for coordinating this particular symposium. I think that it's been very enlightening, very thoughtful, and the quality of the presentations has been terrific. And I'd also be remiss for not thanking Rusty Kelly and Burroughs Wellcome, who have done so much to support regulatory science and support this particular workshop. I have the unenviable task of talking about a big title which I was given, which is the future of regulatory science at FDA. And I know yesterday Martin said that we should be looking forward and not dwelling on the past, but I think it's important to make note of the statement by Confucius that study the past if you would define the future. And so what I'm planning to do is talk a little bit about where we've been to give some sort of a sense of where we think that we ought to be going. And I also think, it's been interesting that we've been talking about regulatory science for the last day and a half, and this is the definition that at least we at FDA use, and of course it's a very FDA-centric definition, which is that we look at regulatory science as being the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess safety, efficacy, quality, and performance of FDA regulatory products. And again, it's a very FDA-focused definition, but I will point out that there are other agencies that also do regulatory science, and I think it would be important for us to think a little bit more broadly about this particular area of science in this endeavor. I also think, I'll start off by saying that, we all know the Lewis Carroll quote, which is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I almost always use Yogi Berra, the great philosopher, when I give presentations, and so I will say I happen to like the way he said it a little bit better, which is, if you don't know where you're going, you'll wind up someplace else. And I think that, our science board, and there are many folks in the room who have participated in our science board over the years, sort of pointed out to us in a report that they issued back in 2007 that we had probably gotten a little bit off track going down the road for regulatory science. When they published this report that was called FDA Science and Mission at Risk, I think this has been alluded to once or twice over the course of the day, where they really called out the agency for allowing the scientific enterprise at FDA to deteriorate over the years for a whole variety of reasons. But that particular report raised very serious concerns about the health of science at FDA, and it identified several causes as being critical for why this may have happened. One of them was chronic underfunding due to other priorities, deterioration and loss of scientific expertise, and I think interestingly, even at that point, they pointed out that there were increasing legislative mandates and responsibilities that were brought to the agency without corresponding resources to support them. And I do think it's really interesting to look at it back at that time in 2007, because this is what's happened since then. And I think suffice it to say that there has been a deluge of additional responsibilities that have come to the agency. And you can just look at that list and see that almost every year there have been new responsibilities, and several of these have been major new responsibilities, including the Tobacco Control Act, that brought tobacco regulation to the agency, and the Food Safety Modernization Act, which is a major increase in responsibilities for the agency and the biggest modification in the way that we oversee food regulation in the United States in many, many decades. And of course, there's been lots of conversation around the 21st Century Cures Bill and the current bill that's winding its way through the Senate Innovation Act and the potential implications that that would have for the way that we regulate medical products as well as the way that we conduct regulatory science at the agency. And I would also sort of call to your attention the fact that the issue of not having necessarily the resources necessary to carry out all these additional mandates has continued fairly unabated. So the major recommendations of that report were to realign the science organization for better management and coordination of science that was being done at FDA, to strengthen the science base and to enhance the scientific workforce. It's notable that these are all things that we've been talking about over the last day and a half. And so there were a number of steps that were taken to address the recommendations of that report. One of them is to significantly improve cross-cutting coordination and science promotion by the establishment of the Office of Chief Scientist. And I'll point out that before I moved into the acting commissioner role, I was in the role of the Chief Scientist for FDA. Establishing the Office of Regulatory Science and Innovation. There are several folks in the room from that component. The Office of Scientific and Professional Development to enhance training opportunities, the Office of Countermeasures and Emerging Threats, which also falls under the Office of Chief Scientist to coordinate activities like the recent Ebola response, and the Office of Health Informatics recently moved under the Office of Chief Scientist, and Cass Hode's name has been mentioned several times over the course of this meeting. And then we also established a Senior Science Council to better coordinate activities across the agency. So some of the programs that were directly established as a result of the 2007 report have also been mentioned over the course of this meeting. I think one of the flagships that Russ has talked about yesterday and has been alluded to are the Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, and this is the list of participating academic centers, and I do think it's very important to enhance and establish more academic partnerships to be successful at FDA. We've set up a number of cross-agency challenge grants, including Chief Scientist challenge grants. There are countermeasures challenge grants, nanotechnology challenge grants, and these are designed to be able to provide intramural support within the agency to do regulatory science. There is a broad agency announcement which supports extramural funding for regulatory science activities. These are spontaneously generated ideas that come to the agency for support. And in fiscal year 2014, we funded approximately $20 million worth of activities under that broad agency announcement. And so it's clearly thriving. And the Medical Countermeasures Initiative has provided cross-cutting resources across the agency for issues related to medical countermeasures. My apologies for the top line. In addition, we've established 2 nanotechnology core facilities that can be used across the agency. The highly integrated virtual environment is for high throughput computing capabilities, specifically around genomics. And more recently, we've established shared scientific resources to be able to pool funding, to be able to purchase equipment that's needed across the agency to conduct regulatory science activities. In addition to that, in 2013, we published a series of what we refer to as agency priority areas for regulatory science, and I will not list them all individually, but I will point out that in all of the activities that I mentioned on the previous 2 slides, we place all of the activities that are going on within the CERCES, within the Chief Scientist Challenge Grants, and within the broad agency announcement. Those applications have to be geared toward at least one of these priority areas in order to get priority for funding. And so we have used these not only intramurally to define what our regulatory science priorities are, but also have used them very strategically in terms of prioritizing and maximizing the use of the available resources that we have. It's also important to note that while I was referring to cross-agency regulatory science activities, that there are also all of the agency components at FDA have program-specific regulatory science initiatives, which include both intramural and extramural support. There are also centers of excellence that are funded specifically by several agency components, especially the Center for Tobacco Products and the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Have a series of academic partnerships that function as centers of excellence. And of course, you've heard about critical path-related activities. As far as training programs, there are a number that were established based on the 2007 report. One of them, the Commissioner's Fellowship Program, is to be able to bring PhD-level individuals into the agency, to give them a wide-ranging experience of FDA activities for a period of 2 years, and then hopefully they will stay at the agency and form the next generation of regulatory scientists. It's been very successful. Approximately 75% of the individuals who come through that program stay at the agency. The remainder either go into academic settings or go into industry. We also have a joint training program with NIH, that's the Interagency Oncology Task Force. We are a huge user of ORISE fellows to conduct scientific activities, and we also have a variety of service fellowships. The last thing I think it's important to mention is that in order to do good regulatory science, you have to have good facilities. These are some of the new buildings on our White Oak campus, our biodefense campus, and these are really state-of-the-art opportunities to conduct laboratory activities related to regulatory science. So based on all of those changes that have occurred since the 2007 report, I think as was alluded to in the last session, we did ask the Science Board to take a fresh look at where we stand with regulatory science, and we asked them several specific questions, including whether changes that FDA has made to its regulatory science programs have been a success, whether FDA should consider any other programmatic changes, what opportunities, strategies, and frameworks for collaboration, especially with academia, would best advance FDA's mission, and whether FDA has taken sufficient steps to strengthen the scientific workforce and whether additional steps may be indicated. So one of the things that we did to be able to help better inform the work of the new subcommittee was to produce a report which we refer to as Science Moving Forward. It's an 81-page report. It was posted on our website in July of this year, which outlines the current status of regulatory science activities at the agency, provides details of the current programs, and gives examples of activities that are going on at FDA in each of those 9 priority activities that were mentioned in the prior report. So I think that the good news was, this is directly excerpted from the Science Board report called Mission Possible. When describing the progress since 2007, they said that the responsiveness of FDA to the Mission at Risk report and those responsible for overseeing its work has been extensive, transformative, and laudable. Many substantive changes have been made in FDA's organization, authorities, and programs that significantly address issues identified in 2007. But suffice it to say, they just didn't give us a pat on the back. They also made a series of recommendations, and some of those recommendations, I've tried to just briefly summarize them. In the area of medical product innovation, it's really quite interesting because it mirrors some of the things that were discussed over the past day and a half. One of them is to specifically facilitate biomarker and surrogate endpoint qualification to enhance the efficiency of clinical trials, and I think it's interesting that they specifically referred to 2 areas. One of them was master protocol development and development of clinical trials networks, and importantly, based on this particular meeting, to enhance data mining and analytic tools. They specifically called out full deployment of Sentinel and also expanding Sentinel to the medical device area rather than just in the pharmaceutical area. As far as product quality, there was a big emphasis on genomics. That genomics refers to both medical product quality and safety as well as use for foodborne outbreak investigation, as well as investigation of other types of microbial contamination, to develop better analytical methods to assess nanotechnology used in FDA-regulated products, and to develop novel technologies for field detection of things like counterfeit products, as well as to be able to point detection of food contamination. And then in the area of modernizing toxicology, another area that was focused on in the report, they mentioned pluripotent stem cells to be able to perform toxicity evaluations, enhanced use of bioimaging for neurotoxicity, mathematical modeling, in silico modeling for high throughput screening of compounds for toxicity, and organ-on-a-chip technology. They also recommended that we expand extramural collaborations. They specifically mentioned the Reagan-Udall Foundation. For those of you who don't know, Reagan-Udall is the FDA equivalent to the CDC Foundation or the Foundation for the NIH. They mentioned recruitment of a 21st century workforce and, importantly, resources to match the various responsibilities. So I will say, from my perspective, looking forward in terms of where we need to be going with regulatory science, I would make this overarching statement because in my role as the acting commissioner, I think that this is really a fundamental point that I can't emphasize enough, which is that the study and support, that we need to study and support development of innovative ways to streamline, supplement, and speed medical product availability without, and I put that in bold and underlining, without having any negative impact on what we consider to be the FDA gold standard of being able to evaluate product efficacy and safety. And I still have some concerns that in many of the things that have been discussed, we may not have, they may not have become mature enough to really have absolute assurance. And I mentioned it yesterday about not wanting to get out of the scientific comfort zone that we find ourselves in, that we need to be quite certain that anything that we do to either use the various techniques that have been discussed over the past day and a half to either supplement or even to supplant some of the current ways that we evaluate medical products, that we don't do anything to potentially jeopardize our ability to make the best informed decisions about the products that we regulate. So I will mention just a couple of other priority areas. One of them is methods development for use of real-world data, especially, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion in the post-market setting, but I think increasingly in the pre-market setting, adaptive and innovative clinical trial design. Very important. It's been come up a couple of times, patient-focused drug development. I think this is a very intriguing and important area, and being able to objectively incorporate the patient perspective into the way that we review products is extremely important. And I wouldn't underestimate the role of social and behavioral science, because I think it was mentioned by one of the speakers yesterday that if people don't take their medication, it's a really good reason why it doesn't work. And so some of the science that needs to go on about the way that patients use medications and the way that they take their medications is every bit as important as everything else that we discussed. The last thing that I will mention before I close is that regulatory science is not simply a domestic issue, it is an international issue, and I think that there are vast opportunities to collaborate and partner with agencies outside of the United States who work on regulatory science issues. Just last week in Italy, we held the 5th Global Summit on Regulatory Science in Parma, Italy. It was hosted by the European Food Safety Agency. The focus of that meeting was specifically on bioinformatics. There were 26 countries that participated in that meeting with 150 participants, and so there is a great deal of interest in this particular topic internationally. And I think that increasingly there will be opportunities as capacity is built overseas to conduct regulatory science collaboratively with international partners. So I think with that, I will stop and just end with a quote from Albert Einstein, who's probably more scientific than Yogi Berra, that we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So thank you very much, and really it's been a pleasure to participate in the meeting.
I was going to ask if Yogi Berra paraphrased Albert Einstein at any.
Probably.
We do have a couple of minutes for questions, if there are any for Steve. Yes, please.
Steve Golson here, and I know you're not going to mind if I rewrite one of your slides, but if you can put up the slide with the definition of regulatory science for a second.
Can we bring them back up?
I won't wait for it. I agree with your intent in how you describe that, but I question really what you're saying in that, because I think most of the most experienced people in regulatory science and FDA, both inside and FDA and outside of FDA, sorry, not that one, but the one close to the end, about the gold standard.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So I think most of the most experienced people inside and outside of FDA would say that there isn't actually really good evidence base to support the FDA gold standard. So I'm not exactly sure what that means. I think what you're trying to say is, without a negative impact on patient safety or access to products by patients, the issue with the gold, putting up the gold standard wording there is, the implication is nothing can change. And I know you don't agree with that.
No, I don't agree with that. I thank you for trying to clarify that. I don't agree with that at all. And what I mean is that as we use the increasingly innovative tools that we've heard about over the last day and a half, we need to very carefully incorporate them into the way that we evaluate medical products, so that we don't do it in a way that potentially jeopardizes getting to the best answer. And if I didn't say that correctly, that's what the intent is. And certainly, you know, there's been a great deal of intent to try to supplant some of the traditional ways that we design clinical trials, or that we conduct clinical trials, or that we evaluate products. And I think what I was trying to say is that we have to be careful that when we use some of these alternative methods, that we do it in a way that doesn't potentially affect our ability to get to the right answer, or that we make a decision before the information is mature enough and think that we can assess it in the post-market setting.
Can I ask one question? If we can go back to the first definition.
The first definition.
I'd like to ask you one question in terms of...
I wasn't there when that definition was put forward.
I was just going to ask the question, what your thoughts would be to expand this definition, not just to include the development of the new tool standards and everything else, but really the practice of it, the implementation of it, the decision-making behind actually what we do at the FDA and others that are part of the regulatory decisions. To me, this is a little bit narrow and just focuses only on the development of the new tools.
Well, you know, I think that it's equally important that we use the science as we make regulatory decisions, and so you just don't develop tools, you use them, and there is also a science around using those particular tools. Yeah.
Thank you very much. In the interest of...
There was one more.
We're eating into the break time,
Okay.
but if it's a really important question.
A really quick one. We've focused so much because the nature of this forum is on drugs and drug development and regulatory science for drugs. I just, especially with the idea of workforce and looking at quote unquote small letters or big letters, I don't care, big data. I see some real challenges in regulatory science coming in devices, and particularly in sort of next generation diagnostics. And I would just make sure that stayed in the conversation
Well-
in looking at regulatory science agility in that space.
Well, I agree with you completely, and that's why we use the term medical products and not pharmaceuticals. Thanks.
Please join me in thanking Steve for a fabulous presentation.